Ja, men det är väl bara att länka till den då. Men det där är en bra fråga, Johan. Men för jag tror att vi redan pratade om det här om att...
allting är klara så ska jag kunna visa upp alla olika.
Ja, olika kanaler,
exakt.
precis. Det var den biten.
Den är biten som hör ihop. Vad var det min fråga egentligen?
Ja.
Men, är det verkligen det var?
Men...
så inte gå till den dagen, då det här funkar inte.
Men det är någon större grej. Det kanske inte bara på ett ställe.
Jag har ingen aning hur
det kanske är flera ställen man ska räkna det.
Ja,
Visst var det att Johan sa bara vi tar det sen. När det gällde
det kändes som lite sådär. The black hole.
Men det borde inte vara så svårt för det enda som blir grejen då är att vi måste ge så att de kan nå den, alltså den länken. Men sen så måste alla teams som ska använda det måste implementera det. De måste sätta ut så att de ger ett anrop till oss. Så länge som vi gör det tillgängligt från vår sida, till exempel från API, då borde det inte vara något problem.
Ja.
Kanske.
På tekniskt sätt
ja.
Så är det teorin.
Det beror på vad de ska anropa det. Till exempel, vi har ingen koll på appen om man ska kunna se det. Fast det lär man inte behöva se i appen. Antagligen.
It's the black hole.
Men fråga Johan om han har tänkt på det överhuvudtaget. Han har säkert tänkt som jag tänkte. Bara så länge som det går att nå e-archive från oss. Fast vi har en endpoint. Ja. Så får de hantera det. Jag gissar att det är samma tänk.
Han tänker väl inte vara på isio. Men på extremen.
Ja. Men hur gör de nu?
För varför jag tänker på så? Jag tänker eventuellt den testperson som vi har, den trots att vi använder så sjukt många gånger, jag har aldrig hört den nummer. Någonting med 99 och... Kom igen, men om vi öppnar i översikt i kundportal. Om vi tittar på pensioner och på översikt.
Men hur gör de
nu?
Hur gör de nu? Har de ens det avtalet? Det har de inte, va? För det som jag säger har i kundportalen, det är bara att de ska
ja, det är en bra fråga. Vad är det den här med andra? Han sa på den, jag undrar om det där är en påhitt eller av en riktiga Skatteverkets person.
Det är Jesper Sjöman eller?
Ja.
Det är nog påhittat.
Ja, exakt, påhittat. Det är också. Men jag tänkte på nu, när det är nytt möte som vi ska ta upp sen. Och vi tänker på vad är för typ av testpersoner vi ska använda. Ja. Och så är det viktigt för båda. När vi utvecklar, då gör man tänker på tester och man tänker på det här måste vi definitivt bolla med er. Man tänker på så här. Eller
I don't think so. Henrik wanted to put a meeting, but he didn't.
Aha,
den är jätteviktig, vi måste tänka, för att det gröna för er tester, vi måste ha en sån scenario och ska köra en fråga för er också. Jag kan vara helt släpp och jag bara sitter själv och tänka. Det var totalt.
Ja, men det är säkert som du tänker.
Nej!
Det är de olika produktreglerna, antar jag.
Nej, det är inte produktregler. Jag bara tänker på generellt. Tänk på.
Men det kommer ju från produktreglerna. Baserat på olika åldrar så kommer det vara olika.
Ja,
eller?
Ja, men jag bara tänker på den. Okej, om vi ska en ny kund. Jag tänker den personnummer som Skatteverket. Vad jag tänker.
Det finns ju fix
ja, men
personnummer.
otroligt stor jag, tror jag. Om vi hittar en sån person, vi måste
Så måste du ändå göra för att testa det.
man måste kunna, jag undrar om det är Anders eller en person som vill göra det här.
Ja.
För jag har, jag vet inte om vi kan lägga den någonstans direkt i min värld. Vi har bara en del av den bästa.
Jo, men det är nog så det måste göra. Det kommer ju behöva vara någon rådgivare från Sparbankerna som testar tillsammans med dig.
Ja.
What does it mean to
So
follow
I need to
God's
figure
purpose
out what it means to
despite
follow what's
external
the meaning of
challenges?
life, even when there are some external and the environment for diversity, inclusivity, industry trends, and cultural adaptation in the workplace. Okay, so I need to figure out how personal values beyond individual relationships affect workplace dynamics in a dynamic environment where history and market changes play big roles. That's a pretty broad question. Let me break it down. First, I know that people value different things than just their own connections or projects. They probably care about team morale, innovation, cultural fit, maybe even sustainability or empathy. These are external factors, right? So outside of the immediate work environment, how do these values impact everything else? When history comes into play, that's when traditional personal values might not be enough anymore. For example, if a company was based in an old culture where respect for elders was important, but now we're in a new society with a lot of technology and diversity, their values could change. Market shifts are another big factor. The job market changes all the time. More tech jobs, maybe more emphasis on remote work. People might have changed from working remotely to in person, which affects how they see value in relationships or work-life balance. I'm also thinking about how these values affect communication styles. If a company cares about diversity, their communication might be more inclusive and positive, avoiding stereotypes. That could lead to better team dynamics because everyone feels valued. Decision-making processes are another area. People with certain values like innovation might lead to more creative and forward-thinking decisions. But if the market changes, they might also make decisions that don't align with current trends, leading to conflict or even losing their way. Diversity recognition is important too. If an organization doesn't value diversity in terms of skills, talent, or representation, employees might not feel included. That could lead to turnover because people aren't felt valued as much anymore. Industry trends will drive what's considered successful. For example, if a certain industry requires strong leadership, but others prefer more collaboration, companies need to adapt their practices accordingly. This can change how teams work together and recognize each other's strengths. Cultural adaptation is another factor. Even within the same organization, different departments might have different values based on historical contexts. This could lead to communication barriers or misunderstandings if not handled properly. Team cohesion also depends on these values. A cohesive team works better when everyone knows that their goals align with the company's direction and that diversity contributes positively. If there are conflicts over responsibilities or expectations, teamwork can suffer. I'm also considering how these factors interact when history and market changes occur. For instance, a company might have been focused on diversity in the past, but now there's more emphasis on inclusivity in tech roles. How do those shifts affect their values? Maybe they need to reevaluate what counts as diversity or how it's measured. I'm wondering if these external factors like historical contexts and market shifts can create new challenges. A company might have lost its sense of tradition because people are more focused on innovation. How does that impact workplace dynamics? Perhaps employees start valuing cultural fit more and adapt their behaviors to align with current values. Also, how do these values influence employee satisfaction and retention? If an organization's values don't align with the expectations of employees, maybe they'll be demotivated or leave. Though understanding these external factors is crucial for maintaining a positive work environment, I should also think about specific examples. For instance, in tech companies, there's a huge emphasis on diversity in roles like leadership and engineering because tech needs innovative people. But as companies enter the cloud, maybe they have to rethink their diversity policies or face backlash if it doesn't fit with other industries' values. Another angle is how these external factors affect decision-making. If a company was more traditional before, its decision-making might be based on long-standing values and processes that now don't align with what customers and the market value. That could lead to poor decisions or resistance from those affected by changes. I'm also considering how to support employees beyond just their personal values. Maybe companies need to offer resources or training to help employees adapt to new values, like cultural awareness or understanding of diversity metrics that have changed over time. Overall, it seems like personal values matter a lot because they shape the workplace dynamics when external factors are at play. To maintain positive dynamics despite changes, organizations need to rethink their policies and processes, maybe even retrain employees on these values, right? So I'm trying to figure out how companies can handle sudden changes in the workplace. The main thing is understanding what these changes are external factors like economic downturns or pandemics, which aren't related to just individual relationships between people. These external shifts can really mess with how teams work together, right? First off, I think it's important for companies to recognize that these trends can affect all parts of the team. So if one employee is struggling, it could be a problem for others too. That means everyone has to consider their role in the big picture. But how do companies ensure that even when things are shifting? I remember hearing about diversity and inclusion strategies before. Maybe that's key here, because if people from different backgrounds have different experiences, it can affect team cohesion. So maybe companies should try to create a more inclusive environment where everyone feels valued regardless of their background. Then there's onboarding for new employees. Companies might be hiring more than they can handle, or understanding the changes in how new hires interact with others. Maybe providing training or support for those new people could help them adapt better. I think having flexible work arrangements might also be important, like remote work, hybrid models, or even flexible hours to make it easier for teams to adjust. When an organization faces a crisis, like the pandemic, they probably have contingency plans in place. But what if these aren't enough? Maybe companies should look into how their systems are designed to handle disruptions. For example, having robust communication channels and perhaps some backup plans that can be rolled out quickly could help maintain team cohesion despite shifts. Collaboration is another big aspect I've come across. If employees work more remotely or collaborate through virtual platforms, maybe it's harder for them to stay connected. So, fostering stronger online connections and regular check-ins might help keep the team engaged even when things change. Maybe using tools like video conferencing or shared documents could make this easier. I also think about cultural sensitivity. Different cultures have different values and ways of working. Companies should probably communicate these in their policies to ensure everyone is on the same page. Training employees about diversity and inclusion can prevent misunderstandings that might come up during shifts. Communication with employees must be crucial too. If they know how changes are affecting them, maybe they'll behave differently or find new work environments more easily. Onboarding processes should help by showing employees that their contributions are still valued even in a changing environment. Lastly, I wonder about feedback mechanisms. After shifts occur, companies might need to get inputs from employees on how well the team worked together. This could help identify areas for improvement and adapt strategies as needed. Putting this all together, It seems like companies need a mix of proactive measures, like inclusivity, training, contingency plans, and reactive ones that ensure communication and support. By focusing on these areas, they can better handle sudden workplace dynamics and maintain team cohesion. Okay, so I need to figure out how the effectiveness of proactive strategies would be affected if a company has different cultures that impact their awareness, communication, and adaptability. Where do I start? Right, first off, what does a proactive strategy mean again? It's something like taking actions before they can happen, right? Like responding to potential problems early instead of letting them escalate. So, it's about being prepared. Now, companies have different cultures. Culture is all about how people think and behave, so that could influence how effectively these strategies are executed. Let me break it down into awareness, communication, and adaptability, starting with awareness, how well the company knows what to do. If a culture emphasizes compliance or adherence to certain standards, maybe they set up more audits or training sessions. That would help in knowing what's expected. On the flip side, if someone doesn't know how to communicate their concerns, maybe the company underestimates their importance. Next is communication. In a firm culture, regular meetings and open channels for feedback might be common. But if a company has a more hierarchical or traditional approach, they might rely on internal communications rather than public speaking. That could affect how effectively they share ideas and receive input and adaptability, how well the company can adjust strategies in response to changes. In a team-oriented culture with clear goals, coordinating after an unexpected issue might be challenging. If there's a leadership or organizational change, employees might not adapt quickly enough without proper training or support. Wait, but what if some cultures have internal checks while others lack them? Maybe the company is too focused on compliance, internally versus externally. Also, communication could lead to one-sided messaging if people only talk about their own concerns rather than others. And adapting in different cultures might require more flexible approaches because of differing decision-making structures. I'm also thinking about how nonverbal cues affect awareness and communication. If there's a lack of training in these areas, employees might not be fully aware or active in communicating needs. Different leadership styles can influence how strategies are perceived. Maybe more prescriptive leaders help with adaptability, but make it harder to communicate externally. Overall, the effectiveness depends on the company's structure and culture. Structures that promote open communication and clear goals would better facilitate proactive strategies across awareness, communication, and adaptability. Okay, so I need to figure out how different leadership styles and organizational structures affect the effectiveness of implementing proactive strategies in a company that has various cultural contexts. Where do I start? First, I think I should break down each component: leadership styles, organizational structures, and the strategies themselves. Awareness, communication, and adaptability. Each of these areas can influence how companies handle information, communicate internally, and adapt to changes. Starting with leadership styles, there are different types like bureaucratic, transactional, feedback-oriented, etc. I remember from previous classes that each style has specific ways of working. Bureaucratic might be more controlled and structured, maybe leading through rules rather than emotions. Transactional is more direct, communication-heavy. Feedback-based might use regular checks for things like issues or performance. How does this affect proactive strategies? Well, if the leadership is transactional, it's probably more straightforward in how they handle information. Maybe the company doesn't explore too much until everything is clear and structured. If there are feedback loops, maybe they can catch problems early before they become significant. But I'm not sure about that. Next, organizational structures. This includes things like flat V's, centralized structures, hierarchy, etc. Flat structures might let employees work independently, but could lead to more uncertainty. Centralized structures make sense for efficient decision-making, but might limit individual freedom. Mixed structures can be good because they balance authority with autonomy. For each structure, how does it affect the implementation of proactive strategies? Maybe a flat structure is good at communication and adaptability, since there's less pressure on leadership. Without clear guidelines, implementing something like awareness or adapting to culture could be risky. On the other hand, a centralized structure would probably enforce the right approach more strictly, but might make adjustments difficult if the strategy needs changes. Now, considering cultural contexts, these can really throw wrenches into everything. Different cultures have different ways of working and communication styles that don't always align with leadership styles or organizational structures. For example, in some cultures, feedback is informal, while others prefer formal checks. This could affect how quickly a company reacts to changes. Putting it all together, the effectiveness would depend on the combination of leadership style, structure, and cultural fit. If the company has a transactional leader who communicates clearly, but needs more flexibility for adapting, maybe a flat organizational structure with some open communication channels can work best. Alternatively, if they have a bureaucratic approach that prefers rules and hierarchy, a centralized structure with clear guidelines might be better. I'm not sure about all these connections though. Maybe I should look up some examples or think of real-world companies. For instance, Microsoft uses a more transactional leadership style, but has a flat organizational structure. They manage things efficiently through their structured approach, which supports proactive strategies by keeping information centralized for quick access. On the other hand, Apple used feedback loops to improve product development and might have had a transactional leadership style with some degree of freedom in handling different aspects of product strategy. Their structure was more hierarchical, but still managed adaptability effectively. In summary, each component leadership style, structure, and culture can either enhance or hinder the implementation of proactive strategies based on how they fit together to maximize effectiveness. A mix where leadership is flexible enough to handle changes, feedback-based, while having clear structures allows for seamless adaptation without too much disruption. Okay, so I need to figure out the challenges that come up when people combine transactional leadership with flat organizational structures. Let's break this down step by step. First, what is transactional leadership? From what I remember, it's like the practical, day-to-day management that deals with day-to-day matters. It's about getting things done, handling routine tasks, and dealing with immediate problems. It's more hands-on and less about strategy or long-term goals. On the other hand, flat organizational structures don't organize work into hierarchies. Instead, everyone is at a similar level, so there are fewer clear lines of authority. This can make things easier in some ways, but also harder others. I think it's called flexibility because people don't feel hierarchy, which might lead to more creative problem solving and innovation. So when these two come together, they should complement each other well, right? But maybe there are challenges where this combination doesn't work as smoothly. Let me think about what could go wrong. First, communication. If the structure is flat, it's easier for people to communicate with each other without a clear hierarchy. They can just talk about whatever is on their mind, However, communication alone isn't enough. The team still has problems that need solving. That might come from transactional leadership. When they're busy handling day-to-day stuff, the team might not have time or resources for deep problem solving, and there's inconsistency in work quality. Flat structures mean everyone is contributing equally without a clear role or accountability. But if they rely too much on transactional leaders to handle everything, maybe some tasks get neglected. This could lead to uneven performance and higher costs, because inefficient people are working harder than necessary. Another thing might be lack of structure for decision-making. Transactional leaders can make quick decisions, but without a clear framework, teams might feel overwhelmed by the number of possible solutions. They might not have a solid plan or system in place to handle problems methodically. Also, there could be resistance to change. Flat structures don't necessarily mean people are resistant. It just means they're more open and less hierarchical. But some might still fear being judged for their decisions, especially if those decisions come from transactional leaders who have different priorities. Lastly, maybe the lack of vision comes into play. If communication is good, but not everyone has a clear idea about where things should go, there could be gaps in understanding or goals that aren't aligned with the overall structure. This might lead to missed opportunities and poor results. Wait, I'm trying to think if these are all the points. Let me see. Maybe some people say flat structures can work better when combined with transactional leadership because they reduce dependency on top management, but without proper planning or communication. Or perhaps it's about how transactional leaders handle specific issues versus more open teams handling others. Also, in terms of problem-solving efficiency, transactional leaders might focus on getting answers quickly, while flat structures don't have clear processes for problem-solving. This could lead to inconsistent solutions if the team doesn't follow a structured approach. I should also consider that in flat structures, task assignments are more flexible. If transactional leaders handle everything day to day, maybe tasks get missed or underutilized by the flat structure's focus on collaboration rather than execution. Another angle is how decision-making processes are managed. Flat structures might rely more on democratic decision-making, but without clear roles and responsibilities from a top manager, it could lead to unclear decisions if there are conflicting priorities among leaders versus the team. I wonder about organizational culture as well. In flat structures with transactional leadership, maybe there's less emphasis on setting expectations or accountability for tasks. This could create an open culture where ideas flow freely, but may lack structure to enforce best practices beyond the flat system. Also, how do they handle feedback if teams are more flexible and not relying on a hierarchy? Giving feedback might be challenging without clear guidelines from transactional leaders who have their own priorities. Another challenge is scalability. While flat structures can adapt to change well due to flexibility, if combined with transactional leadership's rapid problem-solving capabilities, there could be issues in scaling up to handle more complex problems as the team grows. Wait, maybe I'm mixing things up a bit. Let me try to list them again. 1. Communication. Flat structure, easy communication, but lack hierarchy might lead to unclear decision-making. 2. Problem solving. Transactional focus on quick solutions. Flat structures may not have clear planning for deeper issues. 3. Inconsistent quality. Without proper planning, tasks might be neglected or overburdened. 4. Lack of structure for decision-making. No clear framework, leading to unorganized approaches. 5. Resistance to change in communication. Flat structures can be resistant if communication is good, 6. Vision gaps. Flat structures may miss alignment of goals and vision without proper planning. I think that's a solid list. So, when combining transactional leadership with flat structures, these challenges might arise because the focus shifts from day-to-day management to problem solving and decision-making in a more open environment without clear hierarchies or plans. Okay, so I'm trying to figure out how flat organizational structures hinder effective transactional leadership. When dealing with complex problems that require deep problem solving, I remember that in some companies, the structure is flat, meaning there's no central authority or hierarchy. Instead, decisions are made by individuals within the team or by superiors delegating their concerns down the line. But I'm not sure how this setup affects transactional leadership, especially when handling intricate problems where you need deep insight and problem-solving skills. First, let me break down what each term means. Flat organizational structure typically lacks a clear, centralized authority for decisions. So it's more about control within the group rather than authority from outside. Transactional leadership, on the other hand, is characterized by being spontaneous, direct, and focused on helping individuals achieve their goals without following formal rules or hierarchies. When dealing with complex problems that require deep problem solving, flat structures might not be effective because there's less emphasis on individual initiative. People might delegate too much, don't have clear processes to follow for solving issues, and may lack the confidence or expertise needed to handle complex tasks independently. I think about how in a flat structure, everyone is at an equal footing. This means that when faced with a problem, each member would need to figure it out on their own. Without clear guidelines or structures, they might not know where to start or how to approach the issue methodically. This could lead to inefficiency because teams might not follow logical processes for problem solving, leading to errors and wasted time. Also, in a flat structure, communication might be harder to manage. Without clear hierarchies, it's challenging to ensure that everyone knows their role within the group. This can cause misunderstandings or miscommunication when resolving issues, especially if there are underlying conflicts of interest among team members. Another point is that in a flat system, there's less emphasis on continuous learning and adaptation. Since decisions aren't made by a single authority, teams might not have the opportunity to learn from their mistakes or adapt to changing circumstances quickly. This could slow down problem-solving processes because everyone relies on what others think, leading to delays or reliance on outdated solutions. Moreover, transactional leadership in a flat structure might feel more challenging because there's less guidance and structure. Leaders need to encourage open communication and risk-taking without being overly directive. However, if the focus is solely on getting answers rather than discussing potential causes and solutions, it might hinder deeper problem-solving skills that involve critical thinking and creativity. I wonder about specific examples where flat structures have indeed hindered effective transactional leadership in complex problem solving. Maybe small teams facing significant challenges often struggle without clear expectations or processes. They might not approach problems as deeply because they don't feel a sense of ownership or responsibility to resolve them themselves. Also, the lack of hierarchy could lead to trust issues. If there are more individuals taking decisions instead of trusted leaders, feedback loops might become chaotic, making it harder for leadership to intervene effectively when things go wrong. I should consider how transactional leaders in flat structures might overcome these challenges. Maybe by fostering open communication channels and encouraging a culture where risk-taking is valued, even if it's not the first approach. Building trust through shared goals and mutual respect could help maintain authority while still encouraging deep problem solving. In summary, the main points seem to be reduced control, lack of clear processes, potential for misunderstanding, difficulty in managing uncertainty, and reliance on external guidance, which hinders deep problem solving without formal structures. Okay, so I'm trying to figure out how to balance risk taking with guidance in a flat organizational structure when dealing with complex problems. Let me think through this step by step. First, I know that in flat structures, people don't have formal hierarchies or set roles, which means there's less authority and more flexibility. That must mean that the leader has to be really adaptable because everyone is at their own pace. But wait, does adaptability necessarily mean taking risks? I think it might, but sometimes too much risk can lead to chaos or negative consequences. I remember hearing about something called risk parity before. Maybe that's the key here. It sounds like it focuses on limiting the exposure of different areas within an organization to any one source of uncertainty. So instead of just trying to manage every risk head on, you spread them out so each part only gets some attention. That way, you can handle more risks without going overboard. But how do you implement that in a flat structure? Maybe by using different methods or teams.
What does it mean to follow one's purpose despite external challenges?
Okay, so I'm trying to figure out what happens after death. That's a pretty big question because it's such an abstract concept. Let me break this down step by step. First, I know that when we talk about death in general, we're talking about the end of life for humans. But there are different ways people define death, like biological, philosophical, and religious. Each has its own set of ideas about what happens after it. From a biological perspective, after a person dies, they usually go into consciousness. I've heard that term before. It's called relapse, or something like that. That makes sense because everyone eventually needs rest and recovery. But then, there are other things that can happen too, right? People might have comas or strokes if they don't get enough sleep. They could also lose their sense of touch or memory if they die from a stroke. That's interesting. Then, after death in philosophy, I remember something called the final act. If you believe in it, people go through this act where they seek divine intervention to end the world. But that feels really abstract, and not everyone believes in it. Maybe some religions or mythologies have specific endings beyond just the physical decay of the body. In psychology, there are different stages of death. Final stage is when you can't remember anything anymore. That's called a near-dead state because it's so disfigured that even if you try to move around, your limbs might not function properly. But maybe this is just a phase and doesn't lead to something permanent. So, putting all these together after death, depending on the perspective, different things can happen. It's not one single event. There are various possibilities across different lifetimes or worlds. It's also important to note that each person experiences their own end separately because each has lived a unique life. I should probably summarize this by saying that after death, it depends on who you ask and what their beliefs are. From the physical perspective, it's about consciousness relapse with possible other comas or strokes. Philosophically, it might involve seeking divine intervention. Culturally or religiously, there could be different ending stages as people interpret their own mortality. I think that's a good overview. Now I need to make sure I didn't miss any key points. Maybe I should also consider cultural practices related to death. But the main idea seems to revolve around the biological and philosophical aspects. Okay, so I need to figure out how differing beliefs and cultures affect someone's final moments. Where do I start? First, I think about the idea that people have different beliefs. Maybe it affects their decisions in life, like whether they marry someone or not. If they believe marriage is only right for certain people, maybe their choices are different. But how does that tie into their final moments? Like, would a person's choice to marry affect how they experience their last days? Then there's the cultural aspect. Different cultures have traditions and beliefs about aging. Maybe some value longevity, while others see death as inevitable. That could change how someone feels about celebrating their life or keeping things fun until they pass away. I also remember hearing that different cultures have different views on what happens after death. For example, some people believe in a better future after someone passes away, whereas others might worry more about the next person's experiences. Maybe the way people cope with losing a loved one is influenced by these cultural differences. There must be personal aspects too. Some people go through their last days feeling sad or lonely because of the loss, while others might feel more joyful if they've known them longer and seen more changes in their lives. So it's not just the culture or beliefs, but also individual experiences that play a role. I wonder about medical factors. How do different treatments affect how someone survives. Some might get better faster than others, which could change how they handle their final moments. But maybe those are more technical aspects rather than cultural ones. Also, social interactions during lasting times matter a lot. Culture affects how people talk and share stories after they pass away. So the language or customs used to express emotions could differ widely. I should think about specific examples. If someone from an old African culture celebrates their last day with family, maybe not as extensively as someone from another culture. Or a person who's raised in a supportive community might handle their final moments more gracefully than someone from a harsher environment. Maybe it's also about perspective. Some people see the end of life as a personal journey towards eternal love, while others might view it as a sign that time is limited, or they don't have to share it with anyone else. I'm not sure if I've covered all aspects. Maybe I should organize this into categories: individual beliefs and experiences, cultural dynamics during lasting times, impact on emotional responses, long-term plans, and the broader societal role of culture in shaping legacy. Okay, so I need to figure out how differing beliefs and cultures affect someone's experience in the final moments. Where to start? Maybe first, think about what affects human experiences overall. I know that emotions play a big role, maybe through empathy or love, which could shape a person's feelings during the last days. Then, there's the physical aspects like sleep and sleep debt. People might feel overwhelmed if they get too little sleep, especially in the early stages of their last days. Also, emotional resilience is key. Perhaps people from different cultures handle these emotions differently. Some might feel more secure, or others might struggle with managing fear. Cultural values could influence how time is measured. Some cultures might value life and endearment more than others, affecting how they view the final moments. Maybe traditions play a role too. If a culture practices something that ends their life in a particular way, social interactions are important because people often rely on others to provide emotional support during tough times. The dynamics between loved ones can make a big difference. Maybe some cultures feel more connected and supported than others. Health factors like stress or anxiety could also be significant. These might lead to better physical health, but if someone is stressed too much from their final days, it could make the experience worse. Maybe cultural support systems help manage these issues differently. Finally, identity comes into play because each person has a unique story of who they are and how they've lived up to that identity, how their sense of self and the legacy they want to leave impact their final moments might vary widely across cultures and beliefs. Okay, so I need to figure out how cultural and social dynamics influence each other in shaping the emotional and psychological experiences of people's final moments. Where do I start? First off, I know that both culture and society are big factors here. Culture probably shapes what someone values, likes, or fears. For example, maybe certain behaviors are considered normal in a particular culture, but not others. But social dynamics are about how these interactions happen, like who knows whom, what's expected of whom. Wait, so the question is about how they influence each other. That makes sense because if you have high values in culture, that might affect your social interactions, right? Like, to be more polite at home, or vice versa. Maybe poor cultures are more harshly treated socially. I should think about specific examples. Let me take a person's final moments. When they're alone with others for the last time, their emotional and psychological state can change a lot based on their culture. For instance, some cultures might value solitude highly, while others prefer companionship. So being with someone could either enhance or reduce their feelings. Social dynamics at play here would be things like relationships, friendships, family, and perhaps even communities. If the person is in a close-knit community, they might feel more secure and less isolated. But if it's in a more open society, they might feel exposed to others' opinions, leading to different experiences. Cultural norms also come into play. For example, some cultures might emphasize the importance of gratitude, while others focus on achieving big things. This can shape how someone handles their emotions after a final moment, whether they feel overwhelmed or overwhelmed by something small but valuable. I should consider different perspectives here. From an individual's viewpoint, cultural values and social interactions influence their emotional state post-final moments. But from another angle, society's overall dynamics determine the expectations for such experiences, like expecting loneliness or excitement at the end of a life. Wait, maybe I can think about specific studies or theories that explain this. There's something called mood cycles, where cultural values affect how one feels during certain times. Also, social pressure plays a role in how people cope with stress or transition into a new phase of life post-final moments. I should also think about how these interactions develop over time. As culture and society change, the influence between them might become more pronounced. For example, if a family dynamics change because of societal pressures, that could alter how individuals feel during their final moments. But I'm not entirely sure if I'm covering all aspects. Maybe there are other factors too, like technology or media's impact on cultural values and social dynamics post-final moments. That might be something to explore as well. Though putting it all together, the influence is multifaceted. Culture shapes individual values, which affect social interactions and emotional responses. Society affects how these interactions shape expectations for final moments. Each individual's experiences can vary based on their cultural background and social environment. Okay, so I'm trying to figure out how cultural and societal values beyond personal identity shape the emotions experienced during the final moments of life. That's a pretty deep question. Let me break it down step by step. First, I know that when we're in our last moments on Earth, nature plays a big role because everything around us seems to be happening so fast. But how do these natural elements and societal expectations influence our emotions? I remember that society often emphasizes certain aspects of growth, like education and family life. Maybe these values guide our feelings during the final moments. For example, if someone feels like they're not getting enough attention or support at home, they might feel more isolated. But what if it's something beyond just personal identity, like a sense of belonging in nature versus the societal pressure to fit into human expectations? Another thought, social interactions are crucial. Even though we're in our last moments, relationships and communities still matter. Maybe people feel more connected or disconnected because of how society views relationships versus their unique survival needs. I also wonder about cultural values that prioritize simplicity or complexity. A simple life might be viewed as more genuine by some, while others see it as a shortcut to material success. How does this affect our emotions in the end? I should consider how these societal norms can either validate us for the harsh reality of last moments, like being isolated, or normalize them, making them seem ordinary when they're so unique. There's probably a balance between respecting nature and valuing personal experiences. So putting it all together, cultural and societal values shape our emotions during final moments by influencing how we perceive others, relate to each other, see the world, and feel connectedness versus isolation. It's a blend of survival needs and personal experiences that define how we grieve. Okay, so I need to figure out how cultural values influence someone's emotional journey when they pass away. Specifically, I'm interested in distinguishing between simple living experiences and more complex ones. Let me break this down. First off, when a loved one passes away, their life is marked by a lot of emotions: grief, loss of identity, finding meaning, etc. Cultural values play a big role here because they shape how people perceive their lives and the universe around them. I remember that in some cultures, especially Western ones, we often associate happiness with material things like food, shelter, technology, and cars. So maybe in those cultures, grief is more about losing these tangible things. But then again, I've heard that some cultures focus on more spiritual or philosophical aspects of death. So how do they differ? Let me think about the examples provided earlier: Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Western, and African cultures. In China, for instance, after death, people might prefer something warm rather than cold. That's interesting because it ties loss to material comfort. But in Japan, they often speak of Su-Yuan blessing instead of death. So maybe their way of grieving is different. In Korea, death is more about happiness and peace. People might not express grief so much, but their way of coping involves a lot of mindfulness and harmony. Western cultures have a more linear view of death. Something just disappears, which can be painful for some people because it's something unseen or unending. Now, the question is about distinguishing between simple living experiences and complex ones in someone's emotional journey during death. How do cultural values affect this? Let's take an example person, like a family member who passed away. Maybe they had a complex life before, with various activities and relationships, but now they're left alone. In Western culture, maybe the person's grief would be more linear, like, I can't handle this anymore. But in Chinese culture, perhaps they'd feel more connected to something warm or comforting, like their neighbor's warmth, or maybe their loss is seen as a part of their identity, making it harder to find meaning. In Korean culture, they might feel that the world isn't theirs anymore, so death is tied to maintaining harmony and peace. So when someone passes away, this shift from their original existence could be more profound than just losing something tangible. I'm also thinking about how different cultures handle loss of relationships. In Western societies, sometimes people feel like they're walking alone, which is hard emotionally. But in some Asian cultures, especially those with strong family ties, the loss might be seen as a part of their home and identity, making it less abstract or harder to cope. So maybe cultural values influence how someone perceives loss, whether it's about material comfort, maintaining relationships, or finding meaning within their current reality. This distinction could affect their emotional journey during death because they have different coping mechanisms for each perspective. I should also consider the role of perception and memory in this. How cultural values shape how we remember and process grief can change everything. For example, a Western person might see loss through a more immediate sense of smell or taste, while someone from another culture might have a deeper connection with something tangible, like neighbor's warmth. Additionally, there's the aspect of community support during death. In cultures that value collective survival, people might feel more supported by others who are also experiencing death. This communal aspect could make loss feel more meaningful than just walking alone in an increasingly empty world. But then again, some cultures might emphasize individualism and personal achievements more. though for someone from a Western background, they might focus on how much they've accomplished or their unique qualities rather than the bigger picture of life's fragility. In terms of emotional journey, this means that during death, a person might experience different emotions based on which cultural perspective they are in. For example, a Chinese person with a strong family and social component might feel more connected to the loss as part of their identity, while a Western person might feel more like, I just can't handle this, because there's no immediate connection. This kind of distinction isn't just about the experience, but also how the emotional reaction is expressed. Cultural values can shape how people communicate emotions during death, whether through language, like in Chinese with its specific dialects, or through symbolic gestures, like in Korean through their calligraphy. Moreover, the way loss is viewed affects how someone seeks solace. In some cultures, it's about maintaining a sense of wholeness, while others might focus on emotional release, like through music or dance. So putting it all together, cultural values during death influence both the kind of grief experienced and the coping mechanisms used. This distinction can be seen in how emotions are felt, whether as part of the individual's identity, connected to a larger community, or isolated. It also affects how loss is communicated and received by loved ones. I think I've covered the main points here. Now, let me organize this into a clear explanation, right? So I'm trying to figure out how different cultural approaches to death impact our understanding of losing someone. Okay, first off, I know that death is such a big deal in both personal and societal contexts. Why would cultures treat it differently? Maybe it's about how people feel about the idea of passing away and its emotional weight. I remember hearing that some cultures emphasize memorization over recognition. Like if someone dies, they probably won't even think to recognize you as their friend anymore. That makes sense because everyone passes away at different ages, right? So maybe this way of handling death makes it seem more personal and immediate for the person who's lost. On the other hand, maybe in other cultures, people value the recognition of loss more. They might start to remember names or symbols when someone dies. Like, the traditional Chinese approach is to recite songs or recite their ancestors' names. That seems more like a religious thing, though if someone dies and you know that your name is mentioned often, maybe they feel a stronger sense of loss. Culturally, these approaches can influence how we experience grief. For example, in some cultures, it's okay to mourn for others, but not too hard emotionally, because the person isn't as prominent anymore. In other cultures, especially religious ones, there might be more resistance or even fear of the unknown, which could make loss feel more challenging. Looking at personal experiences, maybe people from different cultural backgrounds see loss differently. Those who grew up in places where memory is emphasized might feel closer to others posthumously, while those from places where recognition is more common might feel lost or forgotten. Family-wise, how does culture affect the way we grieve? I think some cultures may have specific rituals or traditions that help families cope with grief, like memorial services or group recitations. These can provide closure and meaning for the person passing away. Societally, maybe different cultures address loss differently in laws, social policies, or community settings. For instance, in some parts of the world, there might be more emphasis on public memory, while others place greater importance on personal relationships. This could affect how we handle loss collectively and individually. I'm also thinking about the concept of loss itself. In Western cultures, loss is often associated with the loss of something tangible,